The doctors had no other choice but to put Britta in an artificial coma if she and her husband Matthew wanted to have the best chance at giving birth to a healthy son. But with all the risks associated with this, Matthew could not help being nervous. Luckily, everything seemed to have gone great. But 2 months later, everything suddenly changed. The doctors simply could not believe what they discovered. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Matthew really thought that the worst was behind him and his family. His son was finally born in seemingly good health, and his wife Britta was out of her coma. But 2 months after their son was born, Matthew got a worrying call from their doctor. They needed to get to the hospital immediately. While Matthew's heart was racing, Britta was strangely calm, like she knew exactly what was going to happen. At the hospital, Britta needed to do a couple tests while Matthew nervously waited. After the results of the tests came back, the doctors could barely believe it. They were almost afraid to share these results with the family, as they would have a hard time believing they were accurate. But what was going on with Britta? And why did she have to give birth in a coma? Matthew was brought to a small office on the floor above by one of the nurses, where 2 doctors were awaiting him. When they explained to the man the situation his wife was in, as well as the news of what was about to happen, Matthew nearly passed out. The pregnancy had not been smooth sailing so far, but he could never have guessed it had gotten this bad. If his wife Britta and his soon-to-be-born baby boy were to have any chance of surviving this ordeal, she would have to be put in an artificial coma. Britta's brain in a temporary hibernation would be their best chance toward success, according to the doctors. However, it was Matthew that needed to agree to this before they could proceed. Under normal circumstances, they would ask the patient that was about to be put in a coma for their consent, but at this point, Britta was not in a state anymore in which she could make a thoughtful decision. She was weakened as well as given a lot of morphine to ease her pain. Therefore, it was now up to Britta's husband to make the decision. To Matthew, this came rough. It was as if the doctors were presenting to him a decision between life and death. It quickly became clear to him that there was not much of a choice. The doctors assured the man that this procedure would be safe, so who was he to doubt their judgment? He eventually agreed that Britta would have to be put in a coma. Matthew asked for one favor, though. He wanted nothing more than to be in the room when the execution would begin. Strictly, this was against procedures, but the team decided to allow it. Matthew held his wife's hand as the doctor put her in a deep sleep. They assured Matthew once more that she would wake up again, but Matthew could not help but be worried. At first, Matthew felt a strong grip of his beloved and very pregnant wife on his hand, but with the seconds ticking away, he could feel this grip getting weaker. This broke his heart, and at the same time, he knew that there was no other choice. They had to start focusing on the next step now, which was delivering the baby. There was no doubt in Matthew's mind that Britta would have preferred the birth to be as natural as possible, but this didn't seem possible. There was no way that his wife could push the baby out in this state. They were forced to go for a C-section operation on Britta, with all the risks included that this could bring. The surgical operation was scheduled 3 weeks from now, as this was closer to Britta's due date. Waiting 3 weeks would give the baby the optimal chance of coming to the world as healthy as possible. According to the experts present, this would not pose any extra risks for Britta's well-being. For Matthew, however, it was different. The following 21 days were absolute hell for Matthew. He tried to go about life as normal as possible in this period by going to work in his normal routine and by watching sports on the TV when he got home. Unfortunately, he could not function normally at all, as his mind constantly wandered to the baby and his wife in the coma. Matthew hardly slept the first week with his mind being in such a worried state. After 5 days of trying to go to work, he decided that it would be best for himself as well as for his co-workers to take a few weeks off. This meant that he could spend every day alongside his wife, just watching over her and praying for things to turn out all right. Then the day arrived that the operation would take place after the 3 weeks, although for Matthew it felt as if 3 months had gone by. Britta had stayed very stable during the waiting process, and the doctors determined that she was in a good enough condition for the surgical operation to be executed. Matthew could barely breathe. Although the waiting time was long, the operation itself only took about half an hour. It was such a standard procedure for this team that the surgeons could almost do it blindfolded. The fact that Britta did not need any further anesthetic speeded up the process even more. Matthew was watching everything closely from behind the glass. When the surgical part was over, Matthew was allowed to enter the operation room. It was absolutely surreal for him to hold his first child, his son, in his arms. He had just become a father, and this realization made him forget the world around him for a few seconds. In the background, however, there was still his wife with whom the surgeons were finishing up. When Matthew got back to reality, it was almost becoming too much for him to handle. Was he allowed to feel any joy before this was over? Still, he knew exactly what his wife would want him to do in this situation. He needed to be there for the baby with all his energy till she would wake up again. The rest of the surgery went very successful, and it was soon finished. Britta, still in coma, was wheeled back into her room on the rolling bed. Matthew was slowly and carefully following her, together with an accompanying nurse and his newborn son. He decided to take a picture of his wife and child while they were both sleeping. Now that the operation went as planned, Matthew had a bit more space in his head to think about this particular moment. He knew that Britta would appreciate it if he'd capture this moment, even though she actually never experienced the moment, and in all likelihood she never would again. It felt strange for him to take this picture with his phone, as there was no telling what would happen next. Britta had been fast asleep for so long that Matthew felt uncertain about the future. If there was any risk of his wife having to go through this ordeal again, then their newborn son would surely stay an only child unless they would consider adoption. When Matthew was thinking about this in his head, the nurse that had helped him during the C-section wanted to talk to him. She then explained that his wife had to be kept in the coma for at least a week and possibly longer so that the doctors could conclude with certainty that Britta would be strong enough to be woken up again. It shocked Matthew somewhat because just before the operation, they had told him that the waiting was going to take a maximum of 1 week. He and his baby did not leave the hospital except for when they were sleeping in the hospital hotel. He rarely left his wife out of sight during these days, patiently waiting for how the situation would develop. After exactly 1 week, the day finally arrived. Matthew's doubt and worries made way for a ton of optimism. The doctors had told him that they were very positive about Britta's physical condition and that she would soon wake up just fine. Matthew realized that they'd not yet decided on a name, so this would be first order of business. And so it happened a couple of hours later. A team of 2 doctors and 2 nurses was assembled to safely proceed the operation, involving an injection with the necessary medical concoction that Britta would need. Matthew could barely breathe. Watching Britta open her eyes was the single most joyous moment of his life. For a while, the only thing the couple could do was cry and hold each other. Matthew was careful not to squeeze his wife too tightly, but he found himself unable to let go of her. But it was Britta who had questions, many that only the doctor could answer. Thankfully, the doctor rejoined the couple soon after. He and the nurses carefully explained the past few weeks in detail to Britta, careful not to use big terms that might send her into shock. It seemed that Britta was having a hard time digesting the news. But once the doctor explained that the baby had been delivered and was safe and healthy, nothing seemed to matter to Britta. Britta listened to the rest of the explanation before asking to see her baby. She was eager to meet him. While the nurse headed out, Matthew was glad to show her the pictures he had taken with the baby while Britta was still in a coma. Britta watched as Matthew swiped through the pictures, her eyes soaked in tears, while she stared at the pictures. Finally, the nurse returned with the baby. Britta watched in silent tears as the nurse carried the baby into the room. It was so tiny and fragile. It seemed her entire world was changing as she stared at her baby. Britta, like Matthew, could not believe how much happiness the baby brought to her heart. The rest of the day went by quickly as the doctor ran tests on Britta to make sure she was in good health. After the tests were done, the family was told that both mother and son would need to be observed for another day, and Matthew used the time to ease his wife into the changes that had occurred. But little did they know that they were in for a greater shock. The day for checkout came, and both Britta and the baby were given a clean bill of health. They would need to come back to the hospital in the following months for scheduled checkups to ensure there were no oddities or side effects from the operation. The family was now ready to begin their life together, or so they thought. The next few weeks flew by for Britta, Matthew, and their newborn, Hope. Naming their baby Hope symbolized a new beginning, and their priority was returning to normal life. 50 days after leaving the hospital, it was time for Hope's first checkup. The couple felt confident in his health but knew his unusual delivery posed potential risks. Their relief was immense when the doctor confirmed Hope was perfectly healthy. On their way out, they encountered the nurse who had cared for Britta during her coma. While Matthew stepped outside to calm a fussy Hope, Britta stayed behind to talk with the nurse. The conversation left Britta uncharacteristically quiet, puzzling Matthew, though he didn't press her about it. A few uneventful days later, the family received a distressing call from the doctor's office. Matthew was informed they needed to visit immediately, but the assistant wouldn't divulge details over the phone. Concerned, Matthew relayed the news to Britta, who, to his surprise, remained unusually calm. They headed to the hospital that same day, with Matthew growing increasingly anxious, while Britta's composure unnerved him. Upon arrival, they were ushered into a private room where the doctor and nurse were waiting. Matthew braced for bad news about Hope's health, but the doctor quickly clarified that Hope and Britta were physically fine. The real reason for the meeting, however, left Matthew stunned. The doctor revealed that during her earlier conversation with the nurse, Britta had confessed feeling detached from Hope. Having missed his birth due to her coma, she struggled to bond with him, and the feelings had grown rather than subsided. Matthew, hearing this for the first time, felt blindsided. He searched Britta's face for reassurance, but she avoided his gaze. The doctor explained that such feelings were not uncommon, particularly after traumatic deliveries like Britta's, and emphasized that help was available. Therapy sessions, both individual and family, were recommended to help Britta navigate her emotions and strengthen the bond with Hope. Grateful for the support, Britta agreed to start therapy immediately. Over the following weeks, Matthew noticed significant improvements. Therapy sessions helped Britta open up and work through her feelings, and her connection with Hope deepened. The family grew closer as they healed together. Matthew felt immense gratitude to the doctor and nurse who had guided them through this challenging time, knowing they could finally move forward.